But do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science
So what
can
can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give. I think there are a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list 5. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory.
But you're missing the whole...
So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Yeah.
So we are, none of these beliefs can be scientifically proven, and yet they are accepted by all of us, and we're rational in doing so.
But here I think it's absolutely crucial that we distinguish between 2 types of naturalism that Dr. Rosenberg tends to blur together. Epistemological naturalism, which says that science is the only source of knowledge, and metaphysical naturalism, which says that only physical things exist. Let me say a word about each one of these. First, with respect to epistemological naturalism, I want to make 2 points. First, it's a false theory of knowledge for 2 reasons. First, it's overly restrictive. There are truths that cannot be proven by natural science, and the success of natural science in discovering truths about the physical world does nothing to show that it's the only source of knowledge and truth. Secondly, it's self-refuting. The statement, natural science is the only source of knowledge, is not itself a scientific statement, and therefore it cannot be true. For these 2 reasons, epistemological naturalism is a false theory of knowledge that is widely rejected by philosophers. But leave that point aside. The really important point for tonight's debate is the second, that epistemological naturalism does not imply metaphysical naturalism. A case in point would be Willard Quine, the most famous epistemological naturalist of the 20th century. Quine showed himself to be commendably open to the reality of non-physical entities. He wrote, "If I saw indirect explanatory benefit in positing possibilia, spirits, a creator, I would joyfully accord them scientific status too, on a par with such avowedly scientific posits as quarks and black holes." And in fact, Quine was as good as his word, for he did posit the existence of immaterial, non-physical objects, namely mathematical objects like sets. Quine's case shows that the epistemological naturalist need not be a metaphysical naturalist. But secondly, my arguments for the existence of God. Many of my arguments do just what Quine said. They show, on the basis of scientific evidence, the explanatory benefit of positing God. And so they are acceptable to the epistemological naturalist. The epistemological naturalist can, and I think should be, a theist. So the real issue in the debate tonight is not epistemological, but metaphysical naturalism. And Dr. Rosenberg hasn't given us any reason to think that metaphysical naturalism is true. So, what can we say about metaphysical naturalism? Well, again, I want to make 2 points. First, my arguments for the existence of God show that metaphysical naturalism is not true. there is a personal, transcendent reality beyond the physical universe. But secondly, I think that metaphysical naturalism is so contrary to reason and experience as to be absurd. And in the following arguments, the first premise in every case is taken from Dr. Rosenberg's own book. So, first, the argument from intentionality. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I cannot think about anything. That's because there are no intentional states. But 2, I am thinking about naturalism, from which it follows 3, therefore, naturalism is not true. So if you think that you ever think about anything, you should conclude that naturalism is false. Second, the argument from meaning. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, no sentence has any meaning. And he says that all the sentences in his own book are in fact meaningless. But premise 2, premise 1 has meaning. We all understood it. And therefore it follows that 3, naturalism is not true. Third, argument from truth. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, there are no true sentences. And that's because they're all meaningless. But 2, premise 1 is true. That's what the naturalist believes and asserts, from which it follows 3, therefore naturalism is not true. Fourth, the argument from moral praise and blame. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, then I am not morally praiseworthy or blameworthy for any of my actions, because, as I said, on his view, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But 2, I am morally praiseworthy and blameworthy for at least some of my actions. If you think that you've ever done something truly wrong or truly good, then you should conclude that 3, therefore, naturalism is not true. Fifth, the argument from freedom. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not do anything freely. Everything is determined. But 2, I can freely agree or disagree with premise 1, from which it follows 3, therefore, naturalism is not true. Sixth, the argument from purpose. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not plan to do anything. But 2, I planned to come to tonight's debate. That's why I'm here. From which it follows 3, therefore naturalism is not true. Seventh, the argument from enduring. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not endure for 2 moments of time. But 2, I have been sitting here for more than a minute. If you think that you're the same person who walked into the room tonight, then you should agree that 3, therefore naturalism is not true. And finally, the argument from personal existence. This is perhaps the coup de grace against naturalism. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not exist. He says there are no selves, there are no persons, no first-person perspectives. But 2, I do exist. I know this as certainly as I know anything, from which it follows, therefore, naturalism is not true. In a word, metaphysical naturalism is absurd. Now, it was striking as we listened to Dr. Shook in his opening speech that he presented no argument that naturalism is true. Remember, naturalism is the view that physical reality is all there is, that there is nothing beyond the physical world. And in fact, Dr. Shook can't present any argument to prove that. Indeed, he actually admits it. For example, on his website, he says, it is impossible to prove by experience, reason, or science that nothing supernatural exists. But that is what naturalism affirms, that nothing supernatural exists. Physical reality is all there is, and yet he admits you can't prove it by reason, science, and experience. This is just to admit that naturalism cannot be proved true. It can only be accepted by faith. But the problem is, you see, naturalism forbids taking anything by faith. He says, again on the website, if naturalism needs outside assistance with fully understanding its own foundations, then naturalism is evidently incomplete and false. So, in order to be a naturalist, you have to deny the foundations of naturalism, namely reason, science, and experience are the only sources of authority, because otherwise you can't believe that the natural world is all there is.
Now, we do science with our mind. And what I want you to think about now is not the philosophy of science, but the fact that we can do it. Because to me, one of the greatest evidence is that nature is not all that exists, is the fact that we can do science. Now let me try and proceed with the argument. It starts with Darwin and something he wrote. Let me read it to you. With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? Now, that particular statement is being subjected at the moment to an immense amount of philosophical analysis in the light of the way in which science is going. Because you see, many people hold that the driving force of the natural processes that eventually produced our human cognitive faculties were not primarily concerned with truth at all, but with survival. And we all know what has generally happened and still happens to truth when individuals or commercial enterprises or nations, motivated by what Dawkins calls their selfish genes, feel themselves threatened in the struggle for survival. They are essentially obliged to regard thought as some kind of neurophysiological phenomenon. Now, from the evolutionary perspective, the neurophysiology might, of course, well be adaptive. But why for one moment would one think that beliefs caused by the neurophysiology should be mostly true? After all, as the chemist Haldane pointed out long ago, if the thoughts in my mind are just the motions of atoms in my brain, a mechanism that has arisen by mindless, unguided processes, why should I believe anything it tells me, including the fact that it's made of atoms? Now, this is, to my mind, very important indeed. One of America's leading philosophers, Alvin Plantinga, puts it this way: if Dawkins is right, and we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing to do with God. I find that fascinating. In other words, I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen, that it's not irrational to believe in supernature. It is irrational to believe solely in nature. The boot is entirely on the other foot. Atheistic reductionism undermines the foundations of the very nature of the rationality needed to construct its arguments, or any argument of any kind whatsoever. And I think that the new atheists have signally failed to appreciate the catastrophic implications of their view for science. A very interesting sidelight is thrown on this by Nietzsche. Listen to this. Only if we assume a God, this is Nietzsche, only if we assume a God who is morally our like, can truth and the search for truth be at all something meaningful and promising of success. This God left aside, the question is permitted whether being deceived is not one of the conditions of life. So, ladies and gentlemen, my basic argument tonight is this: It is a scientific argument in that sense. I believe science makes sense as something we can do. And for that reason, I reject a naturalism that undermines the foundations of the rationality I need to do my science.